This is Dan Schneider on this Biorama. I'm speaking with Alex Sheremet. He is someone who I met about a decade ago when he found my website, Cosmoetica, and the discussion will begin in a moment. Alex Sheremet is a writer. I've interviewed him a number of times on my Dan Schneider video interview series. And he is someone that I met about a decade ago when he contacted me about my website, Cosmoetica. Uh, Unlike some of the other people that I've interviewed, Alex is significantly younger than me, whereas most of the other people I've interviewed thus far have been my age or older. So, Alex, let me ask you about your life and times. Where were you born? Were you born in the U.S.?
I was born in the USSR, what is now known as Belarus. I was born in a city named Gomulin. It was a few hundred miles from the Chernobyl disaster in Ukraine. So at the time, anybody that was born in the vicinity, their priority was to leave and go as far as they could. Now we know that scientifically, these kinds of fears were unwarranted. By the time, with the secrecy of the USSR government, couldn't really fault people for wanting to leave. So I stayed there until I was 5 or 6, came to Brooklyn in New York City, and I pretty much have been in Brooklyn and Queens for most of my life since then.
Were you initially schooled or learned to speak, I guess it's Russian or Belarusian? Are they separate? Or was English your first language?
Well, yeah, two languages are separate. Russian and Belarusian are different languages. But I grew up speaking Russian. In fact, when I came to the United States, first grade, I knew no English whatsoever. I remember in the first year just being shuffled from class to class. I don't think in the first school that I was in, they even had an ESL program. So essentially, I was just sort of sitting around not doing much at all. When I was in Belarus, there was kindergarten programs like that, but I tried to stay away as far as possible. I stayed with my grandparents, so my schooling really began only in first grade when I moved to the United States. I remember by the time I hit second grade, I was already fluent, which is exactly what you'd expect. Anybody that learns any sort of language from the time they're 5 or 6, they're gonna be absolutely as if they were a native speaker very, very quickly. So that's kind of the trajectory I feel that most people follow.
Are you a naturalized citizen now?
Naturalized, yes, since I was I believe 20 or 21.
So let me ask you about the background of your family. What do you know of your family when they were living in Belarus? How many generations back do you know? Do you know like of an Uncle Dmitri back in the 1880s or something? Or how far back does your family tree go?
I've never communicated too much with my extended family. I have a couple of grandparents. My mother. I never knew my father. I have an identical twin. But beyond that, I keep in contact with people every once in a while, but I'm not exactly close to anyone other than my immediate family.
You mentioned a grandmother and great-grandmother, and I know that your mother died a couple of years ago. Are your two elder grandmother and great-grandmother, are they both still alive and kicking?
Both are still alive. One is in her 70s, the other one is in her 90s.
Mm-hmm. So when you first got to America and you were put in the educational system, what part of Brooklyn did you grow up in?
First year was around Flatbush. It was between Flatbush and a neighborhood called Midwood, around Abbott Wem. One of my first memories was essentially just this shock that I had to be somewhere every single day, and I didn't quite understand the explanation because I knew that there were kids around me in Belarus. They were going to school, pre-K, kindergarten, whatever it was. I was not really one of those kids. So starting first grade here, where education is compulsory, I didn't understand this concept that I had to leave my house away from things that I knew, things that I was actually interested in, and go to this, other location every single day. Again, for reasons that I couldn't quite understand. This feeling of not wanting to be away from, whatever locale that I am attached to at the time, it sort of followed me for a long time.
Your earliest memories would be of the early 1990s. What was the neighborhood that you grew up in? What was its ethnic and religious makeup?
Well, my first memories were of Belarus. Is that what you mean?
Well, I mean, if you have some memories, sure, you can talk about that. But then let's go ahead to your first American memories, because you do have memories of Belarus.
Yeah, I mean, I have memories actually probably go back to maybe 3 or 4 years old.
Uh-huh.
The only really, I think, significant memory to me now from Belarus is when I had some friends from the neighborhood. I would visit their apartments and so on and so forth. There was this one kid who had a toy. I don't remember what toy it was exactly, but I remember that I really, really wanted it. And for a long time, I would come over, I would play with it, and I would start scheming ways to sort of get it into my possession. And eventually, I'm not sure exactly how, I was able to steal this toy from him. And I spent all this time, just kind of building it up, wanting it. But as soon as it formally came into my possession, I immediately thought, as much as I wanted it, this thing, it can never actually ever be mine. It belongs to somebody else. It still, in a sense, belongs to someone else. So no matter what I want, this thing is not in its proper place. It's been kind of, stripped away. So, and I remember just very strongly feeling that this thing can never be mine. And as soon as I had it, I just sort of, let it go. That's probably a strong formative memory, simply because I feel like, I'm not sure when kids typically develop a strong moral sense or any kind of ethical dimension to their thinking, but it did strongly affect me at the time.
Well, let's skip ahead to Brooklyn. As I said, what was the ethnic and maybe religious makeup of your neighborhood?
The first neighborhood in Flatbush, it was, I'd say it's a mix of white and black, pretty much what it is right now. But after spending a year there, we moved into a house in Borough Park. Borough Park was then and still is primarily a Hasidic Jewish community. So most of the families around me, they were Hasidic Jews. You had, every once in a while, you had Mexicans, across the street. You had small segments of an Asian population, maybe 10, 15 blocks down. But it was, in my area at least, primarily Jewish, with these kinds of like mini enclaves that were kind of bounded by just a single block or two. So beyond the strong sort of Jewish presence, it was just kind of bits and pieces of everybody else.
So you, from what I remember from talks that we've had, you don't know who your father was then? You don't know his identity?
I have some suspicions of who he might be, but I've never really taken an interest in such things. I know a lot of people growing up, especially men, if they grew up with that father, they also grew up with some sort of either regret or a feeling like they missed out in some way. I don't necessarily feel that way myself, partly because I did have a strong, almost masculine figure in my mother. But on the other hand, I almost feel like if I would have been brought up any differently than I am now, rather than I was, any sort of path in life that you take, especially if it's artistic, you're sort of on this kind of razor's edge. Anything can push you in a different direction. And I don't think I should have been pushed in any other direction than the one that I went in. So there's no sort of feeling of I wish I knew this or I wish I didn't know that. Anything that happened, good or bad, in a sense, it was formative. It got me, precisely to where I needed to go. It's not something that I could look at as any kind of tangible regret.
You mentioned your mother. From what you've told me, your mother was quite the character. She was very superstitious. She was a chronic gambler, and she died just a couple of years ago. What are your major memories of your mother from youth to till her death?
Well, I remember at the time probably a very large issue, at least until I was 9 or 10, was the fact that she was never a truly stable presence in my life. She'd always had to be out somewhere working, often, working jags for like a few weeks at a time out of the house. She never had what you would call a regular 9 to 5 job, nor did she ever work for any person. She always worked for herself. So essentially, it was this feeling of, I'm a little bit disembodied when it comes to having any kind of anchors in my life. But by the time I reached 9 or 10 years old, I realized, well, this is not something that she wants to necessarily do. This is something that has to happen. This is how adults and their children relate, in a sense. There is, on the one hand, there ought to be warmth, there ought to be closeness, but there's also kind of distance because you are very separate people. And when I see a lot of parents around now, especially people that I knew growing up that are parents already, it's almost as if their children, in a sense, become their identity. And I was never my mother's identity, even though she might have felt like it in some ways, or she might have said so. I knew I was never truly her identity, and I think this is a very good and healthy thing. So if I ever do have children in the future, I think this kind of model is something that is useful. It's something that I would want for myself and my children, as far as not being so caught up in each other's lives, and yet having enough warmth where you could have a genuine bonding relationship, but not necessarily in a way where you become the same person or you become too intertwined. I don't think that's healthy.
You mentioned that you have an identical twin brother. A lot of people, when they hear that, they automatically assume that twins are very much alike, because people think of the twin studies where even twins raised apart are very similar. Your brother is involved in the arts. What kind of an artist is he, and what is your relationship with him?
He does visual arts. It's interesting because when I was young, I was very interested in visual arts. I thought when I was 10, 11, or 12 that I would eventually go into the visual arts. I would spend most of my time drawing and painting, things like that. Eventually, I stopped that, and my brother, he was the one that picked up more visual art aspect. And he's sort of in between that and also does video game design right now. We do have a relationship, but as you've hinted earlier, being an identical twin, yes, you definitely have many similarities. You have things that you notice about each other that are essentially you, in a sense. And we often have little situations where we will be at the same store. New York City is pretty large, but we have run into each other in the same store multiple times throughout the year. We live 15, 20 miles away from each other, and yet we still run into each other frequently. There's something in us that's driving us to be somewhere at the same time. There's something in us that makes us sort of have similar, I guess, emotional responses to at least some stimuli. But beyond that, we do have a number of differences, and I think a lot of it has to do with how our high school years sort of passed, and they passed differently.
Well, I wanted to get into talking about your schooling, and we can pick up on the differences in your high schooling. But let's start with elementary school. Did you go to just one elementary school? And what sort of school was it? Was it like a third white, a third black, a third Hispanic? What was the ethnic makeup there? And was it a good school?
Well, it's interesting because I didn't really start noticing race in any significant way until maybe I was in 5th or perhaps 6th grade. Before that, like I said, I was in a neighborhood that was very heavily Jewish, and at the same time, though, we had little, bits of pretty much everybody all around. So kids that I knew that were of a different ethnicity, I didn't really think of them as really any different from me. So when I would go to, I went to 2 schools. The first school that I went to, I don't have too many memories of, but the second one, from 2nd grade to 5th grade, when I look at the ethnic makeup now, I can tell that it's primarily Hispanic and Asian. I don't remember if it was Hispanic and Asian in the 1990s, but it could have been, and I very easily could have not noticed. I started noticing differences in ethnicity and also just background in general, probably in middle school, because I started coming over people's houses a little more. I started noticing how differently they lived from me. You know, I started noticing socioeconomic issues that are sort of invisible when, you know, you're just living in the same block. And, you know, you guys just have known each other for years. So it's not something that really came into my mind until middle school.
How about, well, when do you think that you first got an inkling that you were artistically inclined or maybe more intelligent than average? I know when I was a kid, I've told my wife and other people that there's a photograph of me with another boy my age, and I remember we're about 4 or 5, and I remember at the time, maybe 5 or 6, I remember a year or two after that, once Watergate got going, I remember asking him what he thought about it, because my dad always talked to me about Watergate and how much he hated Nixon. Did you ever find yourself having conversations with kids where you're talking about things beyond your age or anything like that?
I'm not sure if necessarily the things that I talked about were beyond my age. Maybe some items were, but in general, I found that my response to whatever might happen or some information that could have, you know, passed before me, the response was sort of different. Like I noticed there were things that children would do in 3rd grade, 4th grade that I just couldn't understand why they would react the way they would react or why they thought the things they thought. There was something there that seemed, if not outright irrational, then just somehow chaotic. You know, in my first book, I have in my first novel, I have a character who it's somebody that I grew up with who did so many strange things that I would sort of look at him and I would just think, what exactly in him motivates to say this or say that? Does he not notice how everybody else is responding to him? Does he not see how it makes him look? So I would be more kind of analytical about those sorts of things. I don't necessarily think that I was very intellectually inclined until much later. Although now that I think about it, I did sort of grow up. You know, I was the first kid in my block with a computer, and one thing that I love to do is I love to fire up like different word processing programs, and they were sort of geared towards creative writing. So they had, you know, things like clip art. They had these little cartoon images that would sort of come up all the time, advise you how to write this or how to do that. So I spent a lot of time, I remember, writing stories and trying to drag out something that could be said in maybe a few sentences for pages and pages and pages. So perhaps in some way I had those kinds of inclinations early on, but my biggest memories are of analyzing people's behaviors and just wondering why they did the things they did.
You would have grown up in your formative years during the time when Rudolph Giuliani was the mayor of New York, and under that just right before 9/11, Giuliani's mission claim was to clean up New York and bring policing back to New York. I grew up 20, 25 years earlier when New York was sort of at its low ebb with the sort of Serpico era. Do you recall there being a lot of danger in your neighborhood? Did you see a lot of pimps or drug dealers or gangster types of any ethnicity? Was your mother or grandmothers, were they sort of worried about getting you in before the sun went down? What was the milieu of New York in your early youth?
Well, I would say that in some respects, first of all, I did not really venture too much beyond Brooklyn. I was not interested in Manhattan. I was not really interested in, things outside of like a 40-block radius of my neighborhood. So I would say that objectively that there were things that could have been unsafe. I've never really personally felt unsafe, although I know that across the street, we did have a church for the first couple of years that we lived in the neighborhood, and that church eventually was burned out. It became a brothel very quickly. There were pimps and johns kind of coming in and out of the building. There was gang activity maybe 5-10 blocks down from where we were, and I sort of knew that these things were going on, but I can't say that I genuinely felt afraid because as long as I remember, even when I was 9, 10 years old, I was out till, often 10, 11, sometimes even midnight, just playing with my friends, and it was already obviously very, very dark, and it's just sort of it was a thing to do. Everybody did it. Everybody played in the streets. It's not really so much the case now. I see kids often being sort of corralled into these pens, and you have all these play dates being set up for them, even for kids that are growing up in very kind of street environments in New York City. There's this fear surrounding them being outside at a time when it's actually objectively far safer than it's ever been, compared to the 90s or the 80s where it was worse, and yet I never really had some sort of feeling that I was in danger, although clearly there were things going on that, an adult walking by in those areas, they might feel differently because they're much more attuned to not so much necessarily the markers of true danger, but what popularly would be associated with danger, something that I did not make those associations at the time.
When going to school and having talked to you and seen some of your Facebook friends and whatnot, you seem to have grown up in a more open and multicultural society than I did, living in Queens, just about 5 or 10 miles away, and a couple of decades before. I know when I left New York in 1991, our neighbors threatened to burn down our house if my mother had sold the house to any blacks or Hispanics in our neighborhood. Yet, I've seen and we've talked about, you have had girlfriends you're married to a Korean woman, you've had girlfriends who are black, Hispanic, or Asian, and probably a lot of other ethnicities. In fact, you sometimes joked or said that you weren't attracted to white girls. Did you grow up in a more multicultural, do you feel, arena? Do you think that was a good thing for you?
I'd say the neighborhood is multicultural. Elementary school, definitely. Middle school was a little bit different because I went to a selective kind of middle school where, just by definition, people of a very specific kind of socioeconomic class, they would not be able to go get into that middle school. So, but like I said, it's interesting because if you sort of grow up and all you see around you are white people or whoever, you're going to associate that as a kind of norm. But like I said, I didn't really notice differences in ethnicity until I hit maybe 6th grade, and that's probably because everybody around me, they were doing things that were just very busy analyzing, and the only difference between me and them was I was me. I was the subject. I was able to analyze myself. I knew what I felt, what I thought, what I was doing at any given moment. Whereas everybody else, I sort of put the microscope on them. So I saw same groups of people doing the same sort of things, different groups of people doing the same things. It didn't really strike me as very different. And again, the biggest difference I felt growing up was myself versus the rest of the world. It wasn't necessarily any kind of tribal division. It was a much more kind of, I guess, axiomatic philosophical division between I and everyone else.
I went to a high school that's now closed because for the last few decades of its existence, it was basically an intellectual and academic eyesore, and the city apparently shut it down. What high school did you go to, and was it a good high school? Do you have memories of it? Do you think that you were well served educationally?
I went to first. I spent a couple years in New Jersey. In between all this time, my mom at the time, she felt that I should not be in Brooklyn any longer. Me and my brother. She thought that we were going to gangs or drugs. I think it was a silly kind of belief, but that was her suspicion. So we spent 2 years in New Jersey, which ironically at the time, and still is probably, a much more drug problem than New York City could ever have. Because in New York City, you could go out and you could do anything you want. In New Jersey, unless you have a car, all you do is just be at home and shoot up heroin or smoke weed and that sort of thing. In New York City, I find that it's a much smaller issue. Kids don't necessarily have drug problems in general. So anyway, I spent 2 years in New Jersey. The last year I spent in Abraham Lincoln High School in Coney Island. And again, by all objective measures, I guess it would be in some ways a bad school. It had to introduce metal detectors. There were frequently fights. There was a lot of violence for a long time. It was very overcrowded. And the overcrowding did not necessarily occur from the kids that were in the school, meaning attending the school. Majority of the people you saw in the hallways were kids that were not in the school, meaning the doors were opened up and friends would sort of be snuck into the hallways and they would just be there hanging out. In fact, it was almost impossible to get to almost any class without being late because you had to walk through such a crowded hallway to the point where if anyone was caught with any kind of like a phone camera or any kind of camera, it would be immediately confiscated because there was always this danger of if this sort of snapshot gets out into the world, this is what schools really look like. And I guess that schools look like, but again, it's not something that affected me too much because as soon as I entered high school in New York City, my life changed within a couple months to the point where I was a completely different person. And when that started happening, I started going to school less, and I started being more politically involved. I started internships in various places. I started staying home as much as I could so I could read and learn about the world in a way that I couldn't really learn in school. So my high school years high school was essentially the social aspect of what I was doing intellectually at home or elsewhere for that matter. And luckily, I always pretty much the way I look now. So people always assumed that I was 25 or 30 years old whenever they see me in the street. I never got stopped by cops. I never was picked up by truancy officers, whereas all my other friends, they were frequently, found outside, brought back to school. I never really had to deal with that, especially if somebody stops you and you tell them I'm going to my internship, they're not going to bother you for something like that. They just won't. So high school was the social, portion of what I was doing at.
So did you get good enough grades that you got any kind of scholarship? Where did you go to college and what did you study?
Yeah, when I was in elementary school and middle school, I did pretty badly in school. I always felt, I always told myself I'm very different from other people, and yet I have no evidence of this. I have no worldly evidence of this, at least when it comes to my academic record. Because either I didn't get things or I didn't apply myself, whatever it was, I did sort of badly. And when I entered high school, though, something clicked and my grades just improved very quickly. And by the time I got to college, I was able to go on a scholarship. My schooling was free. I was able to travel abroad to a couple places. Again, everything was free. So it was this kind of a sudden shift. Again, from the time I was 16 or so onwards, that's when I started taking, I guess, the superficial aspects, the visible aspects of life more seriously. Even though, ironically, it was also at the same time that I started realizing how superficial the world truly was, and that you could take it seriously on a superficial level. You shouldn't truly take the superficial seriously. You should do it just enough that you get what you need. And people sort of pat you on the back of the head, and you could move on with your life without somebody giving you trouble. But you have to be aware of what you're doing. You have to be aware that so much of what you're involved in, it is this kind of a vast, endless game.
What college was it that you went to?
I went to the Macaulay Honors College in Hunter. So the CUNY system is divided into colleges across the 5 boroughs, and they have a program for students. It's primarily students in New York City schools who could have been, let's say, considered for spot in Columbia or spot in Harvard, or let's say they didn't get enough money or whatnot. They could choose instead to go to this kind of selective program. They could get a strong kind of academic experience. They could get strong credentials. And they basically get a lot of return as far as financial aid and things of that nature. It's a pretty good program, and it's good in the sense that there's many sort of locations in New York City where schools are underserved in different ways. It could take you an hour and a half, 2 hours to get to your own high school. Kids that obviously aren't that situation, they're not going to do as well. They're going to have other kind of strikes against them, but every once in a while, people slip through the cracks, and they could potentially do something with their lives that would be impossible maybe 20, 30 years ago. So these kinds of programs are valuable, particularly for that reason, as far as evening out the world and all its kinds of lumps and indentations that have developed over millennia.
After college, you spent a number of years doing assorted work within educational systems. Now you're sort of freelancing. What was education or teaching your original goal when you were studying in college? And what was the work like when you were working in the educational system, and why have you now gone beyond that?
Well, I started in education. I originally thought that I was going to just pure teaching, and I did do that for a little bit. But I noticed very early on that there were some people that were able to do a really good job teaching. Putting in like a 50-hour work week. In my experience, I was not able to do the sort of job that I wanted to do. Not necessarily on anybody else's level, but at the level that I want to do, unless I, put in 70, 80 hours a week, and just constantly perform all the time. Because you notice early on that when you're teaching, most of it is essentially the kind of performance, barring things, not understanding content or whatever. If you're a smart person, know what you're talking about. The rest of being a good teacher is knowing how to perform. And after a while, it does sort of drag on you. I think it's a very valuable experience as far as constantly being put into situations where, everybody around you literally, the job of a student is to test you. So constantly being in that kind of situation, it's both a good and a bad stress. The good portion of it is you learn about yourself, you learn how to sort of manage others, you learn how to respond, how not to respond, you learn to not take things personally. But after a while, I found it not very stimulating intellectually. It's interesting because being away from it, I feel like a part of me is sort of going lax. I'm less in the position to have to not so much get angry with people, but pretend to be angry or pretend to be disappointed or whatnot. It's a normal kind of human exercise. It's a normal human experience. Not being able to do that every day, it does make it important to relax. But at the same time, if you're not being intellectually stimulated and this is what you crave, you need to move on and do something else, which is essentially what I chose to do.
Let me just back up a moment, because earlier you had said that one of the things that you think was a difference between you and your twin brother was going to high schools, or your educational experience. How was yours different from him, and how do you think that affected you versus him?
Well, this difference occurred at a very specific time. I was 16. I just started my junior year in Brooklyn, and 2 months in, around it was mid-October, we moved to a new neighborhood in Brooklyn, and there was a library that was literally just across the street from me. And just, by accident, I wandered in. I went to check out what books they had on offer. And at the time, I was not a reader at all. I'd read maybe a few books a year. I was a fast reader. I was a good reader, but I never really read. And I went to this library, and I found a book that I heard about a few times. And I heard about it through some of my other interests at the time. I was interested in rap music. I was interested in, hip-hop culture as a whole. This book came up a few times. It's Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice. And I saw it was right there on the bookshelf. And I checked it out, and I brought it home. And I remember when I started reading it, I read the book in 2 days at a time when it would take me usually months to read a single book. And I remember when I finished it, I was sort of lying down in my bed and I told myself that I can't imagine that my life would ever be the same again. You know, the book affected me very, very deep to the point where for the next week I just decided to stay home. You know, I wasn't going to go to school. I just went back to the library, I checked out 6 or 7 other similar books, and I just sat there just reading all day. And from that point on, I started becoming a lot more independent. I started becoming a lot more confident. I started realizing that I knew things that most people did not. I knew things that teachers did not know. I started practicing, you know, writing as a craft and actually trying to be, you know, a little bit serious about it. And I realized that I was sort of I was bound to go in places where most people just have no access to, and a lot of this had to do with the fact that I was galvanized so early on. It was just pure accident that it was this book that I read. I feel like I could have read almost any other book, and it would not have affected me. There was something here that the cross currents or whatever I was interested in just magically just happened to sort of coalesce in this one book. And my brother, he never really had this kind of individual experience, I don't think. In fact, when I asked him to read the book, he wasn't really much affected by it. When I asked friends that seemed to have similar interests to me to read the book, they did, but they were also not affected by it. So there was something there where things just came together well. Looking at this book now, I don't think it's necessarily a great book by any stretch, but it just came at the right time. And it's one of those things in life where, you know, like I said earlier, you are constantly on this kind of razor's edge. You know, anything that you could do, if you do just slightly differently, you could end up somewhere very different in life. And, you know, that's always, if not an outright danger, then something to think about.
Well, let's end this segment here. In the next segment, we'll pick up, talk about your ideas on politics and art and other things, and we'll do that in a moment. I'm speaking with Alex Sheremet, and we basically outlined or sketched a bit of your biographical background. Let me spend this segment talking more about your interior rather than the exterior of your life. You mentioned a book by Eldridge Cleaver that you read when you were a teenager. And when did you start writing poems or short stories? It sounds like you started early, but then went through a period of, I guess, where you sort of neglected that. Did you come back to that in your late teens?
Well, when I read Soul and Ice, I realized very quickly that, you know, here's a person that's not merely talking about one thing. Yes, it's a political book, but he mentions literature, you know, he mentions philosophy, he mentions the arts in general, he mentions historical events that seemed to me at the time remote from what people ought to know. So very quickly I realized that, you know, if I want to compete on the world stage in any sort of, you know, in any sort of field, I have to know exactly what these people are talking about. And I started taking notes on literally everything that I read. You know, anything I didn't know, I would take it down. I'd say, I have to look this up. And after reading this book and it sort of, you know, branched out to literature and philosophy and so on, I then came across a book of Harlem Renaissance poetry. And the poet that stood out in particular at the time was County Cullen. And he had this poem called Heritage. And I read this poem at a time when I was about to become an atheist, technically an agnostic, but I consider the word atheist to be more appropriate in some ways. And I read the poem and I felt, although I completely disagree with what he's saying philosophically, there's something here emotionally and intellectually that is just so stimulating, despite the fact that I just have no agreement whatsoever. And I wanted to understand what it is about that poem and this ability to kind of branch across ideology and to sort of move beyond ideas into a completely different sort of category that could affect me. You know, because, you know, obviously I'm not black, I'm not Christian. Why would this poem affect me this much? And I started reading, you know, similar poetry, and yet when it wasn't as well written, I had no effect, even if it's things that I happen to agree with. If it wasn't well said, if it wasn't just well articulated in some way, I had no way of responding to it. It just sort of fell flat. So I started trying to understand what is it about one work of art that works on such a strong visceral level, and what is it about another work of art that could be on an identical topic that still fails? And I started sort of developing this list of great books or bad books or anything between of my own. But it was only in my late teens, maybe 1920, when I came across Cosmoetica, that I was able to sort of read your essays and find a way to systematize my own thinking. Basically, you articulated the kind of instincts that were kind of working within me. But if you merely have instinct, and if you don't have a means of pure articulation, it's not really going to get you that far. So I started becoming much more serious about writing after coming across Cosmoetica, when I felt, there's actually a working system here. There's something here that I could apply for my own ends.
Well, as you anticipated my next question, as far as I recall, I think you first sent me an email sometime maybe in the first or second month of '07. So we're just a month or two shy of 10 years since you had contacted me. So you would have been, I guess, just starting in college then. Did you just stumble across Cosmoetica while looking up poetry, or just, how did you find it? Were you like Googling things about County Cullen or something, or did you come across James Emanuel?
So I'm not sure what the case is now, but definitely 2005, 6, 7. I think anybody that has a serious interest in poetry and would actually, spend their time looking things up, I think it's inevitable that they would come across Cosmoetica, because I found your essays, independent of one another. Whenever I would, research somebody like, Bukowski or County Cullen or Robert Frost, the essay just kept coming up over and over and over again. So it was really through that, when I felt like, he would, for example, analyze a poem, and I would think, this is exactly what I thought when I read this poem before, and yet, I wasn't able to fully articulate it. Short before really kind of digging into Cosmoetica, I was doing like little projects, little more like big projects at the time, where I would try to find ways to like systematize, meter of English poetry, and I would sort of go into all these kinds of geeky details related to things that have no true affiliation with poetry or art, except the formal one that academics have forced upon it over the years. And I thought it was a very kind of a limiting way of looking at art. And although I feel like I was deeply affected by maybe 4 or 5 books in my life, I think an important thing to be able to do is, beyond being able to be affected by something, you have to eventually learn to transcend it. So most of these influences, I've tried to transcend, and eventually it happened. And one of the things that I needed to transcend was academic thinking related to the arts. It is essentially a straitjacket. If you are serious about it, you need to find a way out. You need to find a way out, and like I said, Cosmoetica offered some of the system that I needed at the time.
Around '07 or so, when you first contacted me, I think you at one point said that you probably wouldn't have continued writing or doing poetry. What was it about Cosmoetica, or was it more, say, did you find my poems interesting, or my wife Jessica, some of her work? Was it? Do you still think that if you hadn't come across Cosmoetica, or if Cosmoetica did not exist, that you might not be in the arts today?
Well, it's interesting, because at the time when I was writing, I never truly finished a single poem or a single story. They were always kind of abandoned halfway or a quarter way or 3/4 of the way, because something just didn't congeal correctly. Something was just not adding up. And again, I felt instinctively when something wasn't working or it was working, but again, without a formal way of articulating that, it's hard to trust yourself. And when I read your essays, you were articulating things in a way where it just made sense. It was logical. They were not things that I could necessarily argue against when it came to your poetry, I still feel like at the time I was not able to read every single poet. If people sort of go through stages, when I first started, there's no way that I could have read John Donne and appreciated or understood him. There's no way I could have read Wallace Stevens. It takes time, and your poetry was in that category of taking time. But I do remember the first poem of yours where suddenly everything just sort of started to make sense. It was Holy Sonnet number 1. I first read this poem maybe in like 2005. Felt nothing, thought nothing. Then when I started more formally kind of studying poetry and read again, everything just sort of came together. I knew exactly what you were talking about. And again, the essays themselves started making more sense. So I sent to you some poems early on because I felt like I'm spending this time writing things and yet I'm not completing them. So let me complete one thing and try to do as best as I can as far as respecting my own artistic instinct and see what this guy Dan Schneider says. If he says that it's garbage and it means that all this time the instincts were wrong, and you can't really fight against your own instinct. Like, yes, you need the education, you need the formal aspect of being able to articulate things rationally, but you also need to have the instinct to sort of underpin everything. So I sent to you a poem that I actually finished for the first time. You call it poem, and from that point on, I thought, I'm not going to listen to what he says is good about this poem. I'm going to simply tell myself something in here that works. Instead of taking somebody else's advice, I need to understand that yes, something does work. I need to allow this to filter through myself, and I need to apply this same kind of process to anything else that I might do in the future. Because if I listen to why this works or this that, maybe I will put myself in a straitjacket where I'm just going to try to write this sort of thing over and over again. Instead, I need to follow not the particulars, but the underpinnings. And from that point on, that's when writing for me became a more regular thing.
Right before you in this series, I interviewed Bruce Ario, a poet that I knew in Minnesota who went to my Uptown Poetry Group, and probably after you or sometime in the near future, I'll also be interviewing Don Moss, another poet that I knew from the Uptown Poetry Group, and a number of their poems are on Cosmoetica, and with Bruce I actually did some poem videos of some of his poems. After a year or two, how long did it take you, for example, from finding Cosmoetica and just reading my essays or poems? Did you find things about the writings of some of the other people that I had online, like Don or Bruce, and were you able to, because of what you learned from, say, just reading Cosmoetica, were you able to get into their poems, some of them maybe not so good, some of them very good? How did the other people that I've posted stuff from on Cosmoetica affect you?
Well, in general, if you truly start to understand art, sort of you understand it, in a cross-current kind of way. So if I understood the poetry of John Donne and then Wallace Stevens, why wouldn't I understand the poetry of Bruce Ario or Don Moss? I remember actually the first poet on Cosmoetica that I read after you was probably Don Moss. They contacted him either, I think, early 2008. He sent me a copy of Dominions. I had it printed in a sort of kind of like a soft cover copy. And, pretty much from the very beginning, the poem struck me as both elegant, I guess, in the classical sense, but also very much pushing boundaries. It's these sort of loose sonnets that have just a strong narrative spine. There's a clear beginning, middle, and end. There are things physically that transpire within the poems, and yet there are things that are, with all great writing, there are things that are happening underneath the surface that just seemed very mysterious to me at the time, and still now to an extent. And it's really trying to penetrate these kinds of mysteries that has been most useful as far as being able to grow as a writer. Because when you understand things are happening at a mechanical level, it means that you're able to replicate if you so wish. However, there are things that are happening in any work of art under this mechanical level that even if you understand the mechanics, you're not guaranteed to be able to replicate. And I think really spending time and trying to penetrate these mysteries of everything that is not pure mechanics, it is the way to really trying to make great art. Because beyond mechanics, you have to understand things on an instinctive level that go beyond everything that you might see in a page, and you have to start interpreting things through a kind of like world mind. You have to see things as not just the way you see things, but try to think of it as, well, how would the culture at large do something like this? What are these illusions really for? What do they mean? How will they be interpreted centuries down the line? How are things similarly interpreted centuries before? These are questions that you definitely have to tackle, and there's really no other way around it.
How about some of the film reviews? Because right around the time you would have contacted me a year or two before, I started reviewing foreign films, and then about 7 years ago, end of '09, the late critic Roger Ebert had done a post about Cosmoetica. Did your views on art, were they affected in any way by some of the film reviews? And when you saw some of the films that I reviewed, what was your sense of my take on them? Did it jibe with you, even if you might have disagreed about a point or two here? Did it provide a framework for you to encounter art?
I think you and I have general. I find myself in agreement with you between like 80 to 90% of the time. So that portion will always be there. But when it came to film, I didn't really become interested in a film until maybe early 2010 or so. And the reason for my interest, it was much more, it was not really a personal interest. It was more so, to become, well-rounded in any sort of, topic or pretty much anything in the world. You can't simply stick to one field. You can't say, I know about the arts and I do literature, or I do this, or I just do visual art. You have to sort of branch out. And, film struck me as at a time when literature's sort of at its historical nadir. Film, although it's not at some kind of grand height, there's clearly, great films being released every single year. I'm not so sure that there's that many great books being released every single year. So I felt, I need to sort of cut across. I need to understand how film works. I can't simply be, satisfied with what I know at any given moment. You have to keep doing more. You have to keep trying more. You can't simply say, I'm just not interested in that. Any sort of topic. You can't be somebody that says, I'm an intellectual, but I don't know philosophy, or I don't know history before 1624. You can't do that. The same way you can't say that I'm an artist and I know about arts, yet I don't follow film. It's just not realistic. So when I first started getting into film, I saw your great films list and I started watching them individually. At the beginning, I didn't quite understand how everything came together, just like with poetry, just like with any other thing for that matter. But little by little, things started making sense, and I actually tried to avoid the essays themselves. I try to tell myself, right, so if Dan's judgments tend to almost always be right, and he says this is a great film, I need to watch it, I need to understand for my own self why this is great, and what I could use from it in sort of my own work, my own thinking. And when I would eventually actually read the essays, there would obviously be things I didn't notice that you would bring up. There were things that I noticed that I was surprised that you wouldn't bring up. But in general, I think it's much more useful to have this kind of a blueprint of what works and what doesn't, and take it from there for your own self.
Probably the essay, at least in the literary side, that has probably gotten the most feedback from me over the 15 years was an early one I did on Robinson Jefferson, the metric fallacy. Is that an essay that meant anything to you in regards to poetry? And what was your opinion on that essay?
Yeah, so I have 5 or 6 books in my life that have pretty much affected, my own trajectory. But then I have essays that might have had a similar effect. And that essay I would consider on the level of some of the books that I've read. I consider it kind of analog to, I forget his name, I think it's Paul Fussell, who wrote Poetic Meter and Poetic Form. And it was a kind of standard, like a small kind of standard textbook on poetic meter and poetic form in English poetry. And when I read at the time, I realized, hey, there's all these effects in poetry that I wasn't aware of before. There are things that you could do with rhythm and patterning that, that have philosophical depths that I need to consider when I'm writing or when I'm reading, for that matter. But when I read that book, I started becoming very much obsessed with poetic meter. I started thinking this was kind of the future of poetry. This is the way to penetrate things and truly come to grips with what poetry is. But then I started reading poets like John Donne, whose work didn't fit into any known metrical patterns much at the time, and yet there's no way that I could deny that this was great writing. And at the same time, it wasn't free verse either. So I thought there's something else going on here, but I'm not quite aware of. So I was still kind of, battering away at meter and, writing these kinds of like long little analyses for myself on, the history of meter and so on and so forth. Then when I came across the Jeffers essay, it's sort of like my eyes immediately opened up, in the sense that I sort of took this book formally as the be-all, end-all, where I should take my own kind of talents. And here you were arguing something that was not exactly the opposite. It was just kind of an argument that ran parallel to Fussell's argument. And the parallel argument is the one that, in my mind, eventually won out. And soon after reading that essay, I think within a week or two, is when I wrote that I sent to you. And, that's the poem that actually got me writing. Your response is what got me, sort of sticking to writing. So it definitely did have a strong formative influence on me over the years. It's something that I take as an axiom now that at the time was so kind of unbelievable. And I think that you and I, or people in Cosmoetica in general, they take so many things now axiomatically that, when other people do not, we're just sort of shocked. Well, why don't you see things this way? And yet, it's sort of hard to do because unlike you, I feel like you've always been somebody that had that instinct, and not had the instinct just, but also some level of articulation. On the other hand, like other people, I've had just the instinct for a very long time, so I can very easily see how people go the wrong way when it comes to any sort of interpretation or any sort of philosophical, artistic system that they might come up with. I definitely see it as a possibility, something that could have affected me. I could have completely went off the deep end and wrote some kind of quote unquote brilliant tract on poetic meter, and eventually got a PhD and become just the old kind of academic, doing the same sort of work these everybody else do. I could have become one of them. So, like I said, there's always this kind of a thin razor's edge, and you have to know how to navigate it, because you could fall any way very easily. That applies to most people. It doesn't apply to everybody, but it applies to most people. It applies to most people with intellect. It applies to most people with talent. That's why although I think of things axiomatically, I try to step away from myself and try to consider what other people think when they have certain responses that just don't make any kind of objective sense.
I know that my wife Jessica, and certainly I and some other people too, always sort of lament that the lowest common denominator in the arts, and I'll get into some specifically art things, but you just used the phrase going the wrong way. And to get back to your brother, even though you're both artists, I know some years back, maybe 7, 8 years ago, your brother had emailed me, and it got into like a big email argument that I guess wound up being an argument, both maybe personal and artistic, between you and your brother. And I remember your brother would always talk about whatever professors that he knew in painting, and how they might have gotten some show or gotten some book published. And it seemed to me, from what I recall, the argument was that your brother is one of those people who views that art has to be either not mass produced, but have a mass appeal in order to be good or great. Whereas you have been more on the side, myself and others that read Cosmoetica, that that quality is imminent or not, and it doesn't matter if, for example, just to use an example I've used before, if Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass was just discovered last weekend and published after having been found in a footlocker for 160 plus years, it still would have been great all those years that it was sitting in the footlocker. What would do you consider people, not necessarily specifically just your brother, but people who have that kind of view of art, to be going on the wrong direction, or what?
Well, when I was growing up in the '90s, there was this show on MTV called TRL, Total Best Life. It's basically a show where people, usually, middle school to high school, they would call in to vote for the music video that they wanted to be at the #1 spot for that given day, that given week, whatever. And something like that obviously is a popularity contest. Anything that would get in the top 10, almost by definition, cannot be great music. It was stuff like boy bands. It was stuff like very sort of a faux rock. It was just shit upon shit upon shit. And people start to assume, though, that when they leave things like popular music, or they leave popularity contests in middle school or high school, and they sort of enter intellectual fields, that somehow an intellectual field is not poisoned by the same kind of thinking that gets us lowest common denominator shows like TRL, or that gets us blockbusters and movies and so on and so forth. And yet it's really the same thing. The same instinct that causes a preteen to vote for a boy band on a show on MTV is the same instinct in an academic that would foist one bad book over a great one. So to me, the arts in general, they're treated like any other thing, which is not sacred, which is a popularity contest. It's an extension of the same sort of things that they did as children. People tend to forget that adults, they're essentially children that at some point went to a different direction. At one point they went elsewhere, and yet those instincts, everything that started in them, those little nuggets, are still there. And there's absolutely no way that this is not going to affect the disciplines that are normally considered to be, so serious. The same is true in politics. It's true in the arts. Lowest common denominator thinking is the bottom line. And in general, you especially see this in politics, where people that have the biggest number of followers, when it comes to just popularity in general, they are thinkers on one or the other side of the aisle. They're going to be either very conservative, they're going to be very liberal. Sometimes you have some kind of celebrities in the middle, but people fall into these kinds of camps. They fall into tribes. They fall into ideologies. So if you take a nuanced view on anything, you're not bound to be very popular. If you take a nuanced view in something like a show on MTV, you're never going to be able to rally people behind you to go vote for, a great song by Jewel. It's not going to happen, because there's something missing in there that just doesn't tap into the social aspect of the human brain. And the same exact notion applies to art. And people really need to see this. You saw this in Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It applies everywhere else. Unless the world is ready for something, it's not going to have it. And this is such a shame, because if you think about it, just look at all the bad experiments that occurred in the 1800s into the 1900s in literature, and all those bad experiments could have been completely avoided if Herman Melville's Moby Dick, when it was published, what was it, in 1851, if it was accepted as a classic right then, and it became a bestseller, became loved and adored, and the sort of thing that people look to as the apex of human literature at that point in history, if that would have happened, you wouldn't have needed some of the things that Joyce did. You wouldn't have needed the sort of things that Virginia Woolf did, because you would have already had a blueprint for the next stage in literary development in Moby Dick. Same thing with your example with Leaves of Grass. Imagine Leaves of Grass was sort of, locked up and not seen for decades. That would have sent poetry back so long. You wouldn't have had this great flowerings in the 20s and 30s in America and elsewhere, where you had a Wall C, you had an Ezra Pound, and you had everybody in between that. As much as they tried to resist in some ways, somebody like Walt Whitman, they absolutely needed him in such an essential way to be able to produce the things that they produced. You needed that, and when art is not respected as something that is beyond a mere popularity contest, it does, in a very tangible and literal sense, set culture back many, many decades. It just does.
Yeah, it's amazing. I recently did a show a month or so ago on postmodernism, and I had a female critic who literally said, and you can listen to in the show, asked me a question and said, "Why am I so focused critically on quality?" And it's such an it's such a men are from Mars, women are from Venus kind of thing. It's like, well, what the hell do you think the purpose of criticism is? It's to discern whether something is good or bad and why. But to someone like her, and she used, for example, David Foster Wallace when we were talking about him, she said that his writing was unreadable. And I said to her, excuse me, when you say unreadable, do you mean bad? And she didn't want to say the word bad. And, I think of, you mentioned these experiments like stream of consciousness, which is the ultimate artifice, even though it's supposedly making the way people think. Everyone I've ever known thinks punctually. So that was a total artifice, and it was just a thrown-out experiment that, because it has no relation to reality, it cannot cohere in the minds of the mass of readers, even quality readers, because people don't think like that. I have a number of sort of little apothegms that you've heard dozens of times before, like art is a verb and not a noun, or that, art is not about the self-expression, because it has to be when you're expressing something, but it's trying to communicate with the reader. You're giving something to the reader, trying to translate the cosmos. What is it about a great poem or a great symphony or a great novel or a great photograph or a great film that puts some different idea about what the general thing that great artwork is about into someone's mind. But so many of these people are like this woman, and they don't seem to realize that unless quality is there, it doesn't matter what the artist is trying to say. Ultimately, the most radical thing that you can have in art is greatness, because when it's great, people will get it eventually. Then, the vast majority won't. Something like Moby Dick will culturally, for this or that other reason, maybe not accepted. But ultimately, Moby Dick, even though it spent 60 or 70 years in oblivion, has still affected more people than many of the other artists and writers that were far more popular than Melville. What is your take then on the current art situation? Because I've always said that one of the reasons I believe that film, literature, virtually all of the art forms today, television, are in such a nadir, is because most people don't want to make art, and they don't want to have actual fun, or they just focus on the fun without having something deeper. What is your sense, an idea about sort of the artistic malaise of today?
Well, I wonder how different it is from, pretty much any other kind of malaise. Like if you look at through history in general, there's always going to be periods, either due to sort of severe political downturn or some kind of instability, or just some other kind of dearth where art is not being produced. One thing that I am missing now, though, is when I look at things like Reddit, when I look at the internet in general, people tend to write in a way that's absolutely identical. You look at Reddit and you look at virtually any subreddit, whether it's like relationships advice or funny pictures or whatnot, everybody has the same exact sense of humor. everybody has the same sort of style of punctuation. Everybody has essentially the same kind of thought process. And because on the internet now you have this kind of influx of voting, voting down voting, things that appeal to the social aspect of the human brain, they become more and more visible. Things are kind of outside the box and challenging and push boundaries in a genuine way, not in an artificial way, not in a superficial way, but in a genuine way. They get either ignored because they can't sort of get the tribe behind it, or they get absolutely attacked and ridiculed, and because now you have not only like a voice critiquing something, you have like this phenomenon with thousands of votes telling everybody this is wrong, don't look at it, don't read it, don't even consider it, and their mind just sort of passes it over because the human inclination is to pass over that which is so ridiculed, and you actually see a number associated with the amount of ridicule that it's receiving. And you see these people and you try to post something like, if you post a more kind of complicated article that's not like typical internet speak, or you post an excerpt from Moby Dick, they can't follow it. They literally have become, using your words, so illiterate that they cannot follow a complex sentence. They cannot follow a complex paragraph. This is very much beyond their ken. And these are not people that are necessarily stupid. These are people that are in other ways literate. They are, in sort of advanced fields like technology or medicine and whatnot. They communicate with one another in a way that clearly they know how to spell. So they do have these kinds of bare minimums. But at the same time, when it comes to a desire to go deeper, it's been almost engineered out of them. And I think that's one of the unfortunate things. It's been engineered out of them. They see what everybody else is going with, and they have no space, especially since now art has become so monetized and the internet has become so monetized. You can't even have, for instance, a very kind of powerful or creative title to an article, because you need to worry about things like search engine optimization. You need to worry about getting the right number of keywords. You need to make sure that these are keywords that are not used by somebody else before you. You need to make sure that if you're not the Atlantic or you're not the New York Times, that your article is something people want to click on. So this is another one of those things where if you are popular, you will essentially, anything that you produce, anything that you give, people will want more of. So you actually have some leeway as far as if you do happen to be good creatively, you have some leeway as far as what you can actually do. But if you are a great artist and you're working somewhere in the margins, you have to worry about how am I going to compete for visibility. And when it comes to publication and agents in general, this is another one of those things where if books are essentially a business and they treat it as a business and they're wondering, am I going to be able to sell this book? And people read according to tribalism. And the reason why books are such a big business is because since you have a literate society, they are able to understand the fundamentals of A, B, and C. They're also going to read. They're going to read trash, but they're going to read. And when they read, that means these are the people that you want to sell to. And the agent's business is essentially one of, how am I going to sell? So if the internet is much more of, how am I going to be visible? And literary agency is, how am I going to sell? And the studios, movies, and so on and so forth is, how am I going to secure funding? Because now movies have to be very big budget affairs. That will, anything in life is a bell curve, that will start to tend towards a mediocre middle. Any kind of sales. When you look at what is essentially the very bottom of human enterprise, being a merchant, being a fucking merchant, that's the very bottom of human enterprise. If that's the case, then everything will tend towards this middle. There's just no way around it. It's going to have to happen.
Well, I know when you were talking about complex sentences, many times I've gotten idiots, hundreds of times, I don't even respond anymore, saying if they read a long sentence of mine, that's a run-on sentence. I said, no, it's a complex sentence. A run-on sentence is Sally saw John, John saw Sally, and the run-on would be Sally saw John, John saw Sally without any punctuation. That's a run-on sentence. People don't even know that kind of thing. But I know I know, for example, there's also what I call sort of a, I guess, a segregation that people have in their learning ability. I'm doing this. I've got 2 YouTube channels and one on Vimeo where I repost things. And Cosmoetic was pretty successful, but it's the writing part is really not the growth for how to reach people. And even though doing for a couple of years these interviews, the Dan Schneider video interviews, and now these Bioramas, and doing some poem videos and other things. Even though I'm getting maybe 0.5% of the audience, I think in the long term it's a totally new field. I don't think a lot of the people who have read have come over to watch the videos, because when I do get emails about the videos, it's usually from people who never heard of Cosmoetica before. And it's a very frustrating thing. And so I'm trying to put, sort of one foot on the boat and one foot on the dock without being ripped apart. Because in the long run, I think it'll pay dividends. But let me talk about your political views, because you've now started writing in the last few years more pieces on politics, and you've gone to some websites now that you're starting to write stuff for after having written for Cosmoetica. You have sent stuff to some of the bigger political websites. I know when you were younger, you were a big fan of Norm Finkelstein. I just interviewed Howard Bloom. I know that you've met Howard Bloom a few times at his sort of Brooklyn salon. And you've written, especially in the last few months, about the current, the just past election with Clinton and Trump. Do you find yourself drawn back more to a political self? Because it seems for a few years you've got a bit more apolitical. As you're now pushing 30, do you find yourself more drawn to politics than art, in a sense?
No, I'm definitely not drawn more to politics than art. I think originally, when I first became interested in politics, I was much more interested in things like anarchism, communist politics. That was the norm. In some ways, I still think that is a fundamental aspect of my just general worldview, not necessarily in the orthodox sense of Marxian Marxism and so on, but as far as what I see, the human trajectory, I think eventually there's going to be some sort of technocratic communism. I think it's inevitable. I think it's the most productive means of existence, period, as far as if human beings, go from, a pure kind of system of profit towards one of cultural and creation. That seems to have been the trajectory of the last few thousand years. But anyway, when I view politics now, the thing that interests me, it's not what it used to interest me as a teenager. When I was a teenager, I was much more ethically drawn. It was much more an issue of identity. It was something of, how could people do this? It was outrage. It was a feeling of, there was this extreme evil in the world that needs to be corrected. And obviously, I still see there's this extreme evil in the world that needs to be corrected, except I've come to terms with the fact that, of all my, human talents, politics, or being involved in politics in that fashion as being the agent of that kind of change, that's not really what I'm best at. So right now, I view politics in a much more kind of a dispassionate way, where I'm much more interested in the human theater. My website at Sheremet.com, ideas on ideas. One of the subtitle is the human politic. I talk about literature, film, whatever, and the human politic. This thing is politics as theater, as sociology in a much more kind of or psychology rather in the macro sense. It's different than just pure sociology, because when you look at what drives people and why they believe what they do on a very small scale, and you introduce politics into it, you get the same kind of confusions. You get the same sort of inability to see beyond each other, see beyond whatever ideology or aisle that they happen to be in. And I find that sort of thing very interesting. I think it's, at this point, much more an outgrowth of the sort of kind of analytical edge I had when I was a child, when I was sort of wonder why people did what they did or thought what they thought. And I like to point out, the inconsistencies. I like to point out the hypocrisies. A big one, obviously, is, despite the fact that I'm very far on the left, I find liberals to be very intolerant. I find them to be very bigoted in a different way than conservatives, but they have their own kind of bigotry, and it's very disgusting. But instead of being outraged by it, I think it's more interesting to consider why that is, because we're reaching a point in history where a century from now, these things that we get worked up over, I think eventually they're not really going to be much of a problem simply because of technology. So, but to be able to solve these problems, you have to see what they are. If in fact bigotry is a serious issue, and you're like, I want to deal with bigotry, I want to find a technological solution for this. Well, that's great, but unless you also consider the fact that bigotry is much more than simply religious or ethnic bigotry or racial bigotry, but applies to fundaments of just belief and ideas and being intolerant of other viewpoints that really have no effect on you in general, you're not going to solve the problem of bigotry. Same thing with other political questions. It's beyond what is better, the liberal take on taxation or the libertarian take on taxation. You need to get beyond that question, because you need to understand that there's an ideological and psychological reason why people come to those viewpoints. They do not start with evidence and then their emotions sort of back them up. They start with an emotional viewpoint first, and then they search for evidence. This is true for any field. This is especially true for politics. Now, politics is especially interesting from a theatrical point of view, because politics is something that's in some ways very complicated, but something that human beings have not adapted themselves for. Human beings have not adapted themselves for being able to create and understand great art, which is why you've had so few critics and artists of any kind of worth. But when it comes to politics, it's the same thing. You take typical bigotry, and you take with straitjackets, and then you introduce a political equation. Then you're going to have all sorts of fucking chaos. And to understand that fact, it's very important, because if it's a problem, you need to solve it. You need to know exactly what you're dealing with. This is also an issue with things like, with things like feminism or men's rights. If, in fact, there is a problem between the genders, you have to honestly deal with that problem, because there's no way forward. I personally believe that down the line, the solution to the gender gap or the sexual gap, the biological gap, it's not merely going to be one of finding economic equality. There's fundamental differences between us psychologically that we need to bridge. And when men become more like women and women become more like men, it's not going to be an evolutionary change. It's going to be a dramatic change. It's going to be a technological, purely technocratic change. But to do that well, you need to know what the fuck you're doing. If you're approaching technocratically differences between men and women and inequality and misogyny or whatever you want to call it, and you are assuming that there's no biological difference between us that's causing these things to occur, how are you going to solve this problem technologically down the line? What you're going to end up doing is you're going to develop a technological solution that for ideological reasons people will accept and believe in, but because it's not based on biology to begin with, people will implant themselves with this or that microchip, and they're going to be completely fucked up, because it has nothing to do with what reality is. So, again, politics in general is theater, but to transcend politics, you need to understand that theater. And I think that's a lot more interesting than the particulars and the details of this or that election cycle. Although this election cycle in general, I think it's brought out this theatricality and this kind of falseness and the kind of bullshit in just the whole human narrative when it comes to politics, much more so than previous elections.
Well, let's end there. In the final segment, I'll talk a little bit about the future. This has been my fourth Biorama interview. Alex Sheremet has been my guest. As I do with the other ones, the other people I've interviewed thus far, let me just ask first what the future holds for you. As you had mentioned, you're doing now some stuff with computers, and I know you just finished a book that you're going to go back and look at in a few months. What is your sort of short and long-term goal then from here on in your life? Because you're just, as I said, you're not quite 30 yet.
Uh, I'll start with some long-term goals. In general now, not yet being 30 and yet getting close, I'm coming to terms with I have to start to tackle what childhood really was. And one thing that I noticed growing up is, well, not growing up, but now looking back and growing up, is I grew up at a time when culture, in a sense, was at a nadir. You know, musically, just artistically, you know, film-wise, not much was happening. Literature, not much was happening. And this is very important to recognize because, you know, looking forward, you are sort of the product of whatever decade that you're in. If children, or rather those who were children in the 90s, are looking at their own culture and they start to remember it in purely nostalgic terms, and they start to look at all the kind of bad shows on Nickelodeon or Cartoon Network that we all grew up with, they start to view them as some sort of apex of culture, as some sort of a great deep good. You know, that doesn't bode well because these are people that are now becoming adults, and they're adults that have been weaned on the sort of, you know, utter kind of dregs of society. And this is a problem when they're going to be in positions of leadership or artistic influence or whatnot. We're going to have to come to terms with the fact that our, you know, life in the 90s, it didn't exactly prepare us for the sort of things that are, you know, normally considered typical mature adult prospects and ideas and ways of looking at the world. So my goals in the long term is I want to get a book that really considers 90s culture in its entirety. This applies to video games. This is, you know, literature. This is the politicians, the kinds of illusions the 90s really was. You know, in many ways, the 90s was a very elusive decade in the sense that, you know, prosperity was an illusion. You know, artistic greatness was an illusion. Everything that, you know, they were weaned on just didn't quite work out. So there are many people I feel that were in my situation that look back now and they wish that their own culture was somehow deeper, was better than it was. And I want to sort of comb through it and analyze everything that went wrong, analyze everything that was right, and what this spells for the future. So, you know, if you think about it, you know, you grew up in the 60s and the 70s. You had things at the time that were absolutely indicative of the time period you grew up in. You know, you had the Beatles, you had Led Zeppelin, you had things that you could say was great music, was great culture, or even, you know, great pop culture. I can't even point to a truly great, you know, musical act from the 90s. And even if there were people that had excellent songs or even great songs, or, you know, even if you had writers that had one or two great books at the time, the fact is they never were able to sort of take that decade, mash it up, and transform it into something that really meant anything. So much more so than lacking a father figure in my life, or, you know, broken homes or whatever that kids might have grown up with in the 90s and the early 2000s. I think there's much more of a sense of we never grew up with a true kind of idol. We never had a direction to look into. We never had anything to truly emulate. And the things that we are told now that we must emulate or that we should have emulated, some people get tricked into it and they follow through and they do it. Others, like me, they see it for what it is and they say that there needs to be some kind of replacement. There needs to be some sort of idol, not in the sense of like blind following, but an example that you could use as some sort of role model. So long term, this is something I want to do. I want to recreate this for the 90s and find a way to have that apply to pretty much any decade that anybody could ever grow up in. Because as interesting as centuries or millennia are, I feel like there's something in a decade-to-decade experience that is very much lost if you're taking the long view of history.
Well, let me do ask you for a longer view of history, because one of the reasons I'm doing these Biorama interviews is so that the people in the future, after they've read my work and my wife's work and the work of people like you and Don Moss and Bruce Ario, I want them to not just only be able to read what I and we have written, but I also want them to get a sense of my life, and you can get a sense of me from these interviews that I do with artists and thinkers and whatnot, but also the people that I grew up with and or knew at various points of my life. Hence why, you know, you are sort of, I guess I'd call from the Cosmoetica corner of my life. But for someone in 50 or 100 or several hundred years from now who may be watching this in some future medium that has replaced the internet or superseded it in some manner, what do you think similarities will there be to those people that may be on a colony around Sirius or growing up on a moon of Jupiter or something?
Well, I'm going to address this directly to them. So anybody that's watching this now from the future, you know, I'll say this: we have always had people, you know, in history that were never confident enough in their own abilities, that did things well, but would not admit to it. So, prime example, somebody like Herman Melville, you know, Moby Dick was savaged by the critics, so he stopped writing that. He started writing, you know, much smaller things, you know, a bunch of mediocre poems, and he let that pass. He let it go. Right now, what we are doing in the arts, you know, a very tiny margin of society, you know, you will see the 2000s and the 90s and so on and so forth as in some ways a human nadir, although we will also see the germs of the future, the germs of something good. But, you know, I in my corner, Dan and Cosmoetica, and a few others in this or that pocket of the internet, you know, they're doing great things that they're not compromising about. You know, they're not compromising their visions. They're not compromising anything of themselves. They're not compromising the things that they truly believe in and think they're going to affect the world for the good. So no doubt you will be in the same situation. Perhaps at that point, human biases will not have been engineered out, and you'll have to deal with the same kind of bullshit that we're dealing with right now. But you did not have examples before of people being confident. You have it now in front of you. You know, we're doing things that need to be done, just like you in the future have to do your own things. That's the first point. The second point is this. You could be reading my books in the future. You could be reading books from centuries before me. And just like we, in our place right now, we shake our heads at the people that came before us, I get the feeling that you will start to shake your heads at us. For example, how many people now just can't stomach the thought of somebody like Abraham Lincoln? You know, they're like, well, you know, it's true that he freed the slaves, but he was a racist. He didn't truly believe some of the things that he said or did, but he did them anyway. But the fact is, you know, he was a product of human biases and orthodoxies that clearly were wrong. And now I suspect, I believe quite a few things, whether it's a strong belief in death penalty or other items that probably, you know, centuries from now will be completely outlawed and just unthinkable. What I want to say to you is, just like I do not look back on Lincoln and just completely shake my head and I don't completely dismiss him out of hand, do not be so harsh on us, because you're going to see many things in us that you will just not be able to even understand. How did people in the 2000s live without health care? How did people live in poverty? How is there still homelessness? How is the world warming up to the point where all the world scientists want to put an end to it, and yet, you know, politicians are simply, you know, kind of twiddling their thumbs and not sure what to do about the planet's own future. So you will be very disappointed in that aspect, but at the same time, do not be so harsh on us, because you will then have to be very harsh on yourself. With everything that we're going through, you will, in your own turn, deal with the same sort of issues, and centuries after you, people will shake their heads at you, and it's going to be a perpetual kind of cycle, keep happening, and you have that right, but at the same time, you cannot be so harsh on us, and do not be so harsh on yourself. Simply do everything that you can do within your own sphere. That's really the bottom line. You can't get past your own biases to the point where they won't exist. You're going to have to deal with everything that we have now, except in your own way.
Well, I'll link to your website, alexsheremet.com, below this video, and thank you for doing this fourth Biorama.
Thanks, Dan.